Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jim Reads Too Slow. I'm Jim, and this is my Week 1 February Fantasy Stories wrap-up video. Before I get started, I want to ask everyone to please disregard the metal bar that's coming out of the top of my head. It's part of a little experiment I'm working on. If it's successful, I'll let you know all about it. So, to get started, this, of course, is the end of Week 1 of February Fantasy Stories, which is a month-long read-along of mostly short stories, short works of under 250 pages of fantasy. This readathon was organized by Scott and Becky over at the Bookish Bryants, and the first week was set aside for classic fantasy, which is defined as stories published prior to 1971. I started the week with 4 stories by Ursula K. Le Guin from her short story collection, The Wind's 12 Quarters, which was published in 1975. But the stories I read were originally published during the 1960s. Starting with Semley's Necklace. It was first published in 1964 in Amazing Stories under the title Dowry of the Angyar. And then in 1966, it was published as the foreword or the prologue of Le Guin's first novel, Rokanan's World. It's a great example of fantasy with elements of science fiction. It's just a great story. The main character is a young woman who is poor but highborn, who goes in search of a long-lost family heirloom. And now the reason she goes on this quest is that she wants her husband, who is also poor. Now, all of the highborn in this story are poor, because since the who they call the Star Lords arrived in their world, they no longer fight the wars that were once the source of their wealth. So she goes in search of this necklace in order that her husband, she wants her husband to be able to hold his head high among his relatives, even though she and their young daughter, their baby daughter, are plenty of reason for him to feel proud. Well, she goes first to see the elves. They're not called elves, but on this world, they're the equivalent of the elves. They send her on. They don't know where the necklace is. So she goes to visit the dwarves. They're not called the dwarves, but again, on this planet, they're the equivalent of the dwarves. And from then on, the quest takes off. She is successful in finding this heirloom, but the story does not end as happily as she expects. And it's because of these science elements that I mentioned earlier. This was probably my favorite of Le Guin's stories that I read. And now I have to go on and read Rokanan's World. I got the little thrift book sticker that I still need to take off, but it's in this book along with 2 other of her Hainish cycle novels. It's a wonderful world. She did a great job. The creatures, I just need to dig further into it. So after that, I read The Word of Unbinding, a story about a wizard, and The Rule of Names, which is, it includes a dragon. These are 2 stories that introduce Earthsea, and they set the stage for Le Guin's novels and stories about that realm. The 4th story of hers that I read is called April in Paris. It's an odd little story about the black arts, chalk pentagrams on the floor, magic dust, sulking shadowy figures in the corner, all of that. And until I dug into some Lord Dunsany, I started seeing his influence. I kind of connected the dots. I saw his influence in a lot of stories that I have read. Now, I'll come clean when I say that before I heard Steve Donahue just mention his name in passing, And then Michael K. Vaughan included Dunsany as one of his top 5 fantasy writers. I had never heard of him, which is just, it's a shame because he's a great writer. He does some really good stories. But thank you, BookTube. I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm here, to learn stuff. So I spent a lot of time reading his stories, and I'm happy I did. Lord Dunsany was a colorful character, to say the least, in his own right. He had a major influence on fantasy, science fiction, and horror writers for generations after him. From H.P. Lovecraft to Arthur C. Clarke to Ursula K. Le Guin. His influence is, you can spot it here and there throughout the stories of many other authors. He wrote a ton of short stories. He wrote a novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, which Donahue not long ago in his fantasy starter kit named the #1 must-read fantasy book. It's not easy to find. It's out of print now, but it is available online. I got a copy of it at Project Gutenberg, along with many of his other stories. And that's a shame, because it's a shame that he's not better known, not known as well as the authors he influenced: H.P. Lovecraft, J.R.R. Tolkien, Ursula K. Le Guin, many others. So I read a bunch of his stories this past week, 14 or 15. By far my favorites were The Sword of Wellerin and The Kith of the Elf Folk. These were both published in 1908. And a lot of his stories are just different. They're not what we're familiar with today, or what we would expect in a fantasy story. A lot of them are just tales, or what we would think of maybe as bits of stories. He did a lot of world building, but all of his stories are very good. I'm glad I started reading them, and I think everyone should read them. So just so all the rest of the week wasn't Lord Dunsany stories, I threw in a couple of Clark Ashton Smith stories, someone who was also considered to be one of the giants of fantasy and horror. I read A Vintage from Atlantis, published in 1933. It's a little pirate. There's a little pirate flavor to that story. It's really interesting. And The Powder of Hyperborea from 1958. It's a tiny bit of a bawdy tale. There's a little humor in it. I also found it very entertaining. And then to close it all out, I read a story by Edith Wharton, published in 1893, called The Fullness of Life. Now, this is a sweet little story about a woman who dies and then decides to wait in the afterlife for her husband. Now, her husband had believed that when he married her, he had found everything he wanted in life. But she didn't quite feel the same way about him. Maybe until she talks to someone in the afterlife. And it's, like I say, it's a sweet story. I thought it was very good. So those were my week 1 stories. Week 2 is going to be featuring Sword and Sorcery. I intend to read some Conan the Barbarian. And I will... Sorry about that. I had to look it up on my iPad here. I have The Black Colossus, The Tower of the Elephant, The Scarlet Citadel, The Phoenix on the Sword, all by Robert E. Howard. Original Conan stories that I'm going to read. Hopefully I can get through all of them. I read kind of slow, so we'll see. Otherwise, I am still reading this one, Eye of the World by Robert Jordan. Loving it. It's going slow, but I am loving it. And I'm still into Grapes of Wrath. Still trying to get to the midpoint. So my reading's cut out for me. I hope everybody taking part in this enjoys what they're doing. Fantasy, I'm loving fantasy stories. So until next time, have a good one, and thanks for letting me waste your time.